Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Cade, and today we are going to be talking about how to tackle adaptations and how to do them successfully. And today I'm joined by a returning guest and movie expert, my friend Max. Hey Max, welcome. Thanks so much for coming back.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. I was super excited when you asked me to come back.
Oh yeah, it's good to have you back. So when it comes to adaptations, what are some of your favorite adaptations of all time when it comes to source material that you're a big fan of?
I like James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. I think that's just the most recent adaptation I really like. He used a lot of inspiration from like Trial by Fire, which is a collection of the original Suicide Squad comics. And like even like kind of down to how like Rick Flag dresses in that, like the yellow t-shirt. And then I think I liked really recently, I've only seen it once, but I really liked it, was Detective Pikachu was a really good way to adapt a video game into its own movie. I haven't seen the Sonic movies or the Mario movie, but I've saw Detective Pikachu, and I thought that was like Pokemon so complex as a video game in the sense that like how do you make a movie out of it? That I think that Detective Pikachu did a really good job. But those are the two in most recent memory. And then I really like for adaptations. I think you mainly look at comic book movies, but I think some of the best adapted stuff was way before the MCU really got going. Like you have Batman the animated series, and then which ties into the Superman animated series, which then ties into Justice League, and then Justice League has a few seasons, and then Justice League Unlimited starts, and Justice League Unlimited really adapts more heroes and is almost can be a gateway to wanting to then almost go in the reverse way and then go and read about these heroes from their source material.
Yeah, I agree. And we'll get into Batman the Animated Series further in this discussion, but one thing I wanted to bring up actually was how much I loved The Batman from 2022. I honestly thought that that was one of the most faithful adaptations of Batman that I had ever seen. It was just such a fun detective story. It really did capture everything that I love about Batman, and it had it all in one movie. It was such a refreshing movie to watch, too.
I think that I like that's a great adaptation because we're going with a younger Batman in this. This isn't he hasn't been Batman for long, and if you go and look at other adaptations of a younger Batman, like before the podcast started, we were talking about Arkham Origins. That's a younger Batman story, and those all kind of are inspired by like Batman Year One, which is like the first year of being Batman. DC does the Year One storyline with a lot of characters, but it's always interesting because it's like you can tell that he's when it's a newer Batman based on how he fights. Like he's super aggressive in the Batman in Matt Reeves movie. Like you could tell that, oh, this is definitely like he's not the wise Batman yet. He's still young. He's got a lot of frustration to take out. But he still has his ideology of it's Gotham first, Bruce Wayne second kind of deal.
Yeah, and other than that, regarding what you were just talking about with the Suicide Squad, I have to agree. That honestly has kind of climbed its way up into my top 10 favorite live action DC movies of all time. It was just such a unique film, in my opinion. It actually kind of reminds me of Into the Spider-Verse in a way because of how faithful it is to the comics and how it really did feel like a comic book on the big screen, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I thought the way that that movie is done is great because I mean, if you look at the Harley Quinn scene alone, that feels like the most comic booky scene in a live action film in a long time when her imagination starts to take over while she's escaping from her captives in the red dress, that scene in particular, and the flowers start flying everywhere, the spear gets highlighted, or even James Gunn's way of doing the same transitions alone. Like I remember, like I think it's when they're going to Jotunheim, there's a big like metal, a bunch of scrap metal comes together and like shows the scene transition to Jotunheim and like sets the scene. It's very much like artistically done in a way that you would kind of be reading panel to panel in a comic book.
Yeah, and also the fact that the movie actually included the villain of Starro was definitely brought that sort of element to it as well. That was such a fun thing to see brought to life.
Yeah, Starro is a great choice because Starro, he's not super popular. He's a giant alien for most parts, and he's called Starro the Conqueror. I believe that's his full title. And I'm so glad that they just fully adapted what he looks like in the comics. The giant pink starfish with the blue coloring on the side and his giant massive eye, instead of kind of being too afraid to do so. Like if you remember the old Rise of the Silver Surfer movie. You telling me that they put a guy in like a green screen suit and made him look like the Silver Surfer, but they were too afraid to put Galactus on the screen, so they made a giant cloud that was supposed to represent Galactus. It's just like, I think people go to the movies because they want to see how crazy the supervillains are going to look. And I think some movies play it a little too safe. Like Taskmaster in The Black Widow, like that is just a guy in armor for most of the movie. It's not Taskmaster. Taskmaster's got this really crazy looking costume in most comics with the skull mask and everything, and they don't really do it justice in that movie. So the best way to adapt is to, be faithful to the art.
Yeah, and that's honestly one of the reasons why I had such an issue with Batman and Robin from 1997 when it came to characters like Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy and Bane, because every time I look back at that movie, and I understand it's meant to be campy fun, but every time I see Mr. Freeze or any of those other villains, all I can think is, that's just not Mr. Freeze. That's not Poison Ivy. That's not Bane. That's just always how I feel every time I look back at that movie.
Yeah, and I think we talk about Batman the animated series. I think that Batman and Robin actually came out before it. And Batman the animated series really helped flesh out Mr. Freeze. Like he was for a long time in the DC comics, he was just the ice guy. So when you put him in a movie as just the ice guy, he's not a very deep character. Actually, I think animated series probably came out before it because Mr. Freeze.
Yeah, animated series was 92, I think it was, or 93.
You're right. You're right. Animated because I just remembered that it's been so long since I've seen that movie. But like, yeah, they do the Nora Freeze tragedy that was originally in the animated series first. That's how they kind of fleshed him out. That's how they made Mr. Freeze more than just the ice villain for Batman. But they don't at all make Mr. Freeze sympathetic in that Batman and Robin movie. He's just making jokes. They really miscast Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. I don't know why you would make him Mr. Freeze. He just isn't. He does not look like him. He's completely like the polar opposite of like how Mr. Freeze is drawn in the comic books. He's a skinny, lanky guy, and it's just because he wears that giant suit that protects him that makes him look big. But he's in a giant suit for that reason. But he's always supposed to be kind of that. He kind of subverts your expectations when he's outside the suit. He is just this small little scientist man, which is, yeah, it's Batman and Robin is a good example of like not adapting your characters respectfully. Like Bane is in it and he's just a crazy guy who's nonverbal, and that's not Bane.
And I think that because of that is because if you look at Bane from The Dark Knight Rises, I mean, yeah, he doesn't use any venom, but he's still very menacing and he has such a frightening presence. He also has the intelligence of Bane as well, because Bane's not just this big, strong guy. He's also a brilliant criminal mastermind. And I thought Nolan and Tom Hardy captured that part really well.
Yeah, I think that's something that you kind of people like don't understand is Bane is bigger than just his luchador persona. He just that is like he's a really interesting villain in the sense that he is kind of this luchador, but he's also like brilliant and he's one of Batman's greatest adversaries. Like he's supposed to be the greatest hurdle for like an older Batman at one point. Like like most of the times he's appeared, Batman's been Batman for at least 10 years, and Bane is like his newest challenge. And Bane beats him. And that's why it's always such a critical plot point in a Batman story that Batman doesn't beat Bane the first time around.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I praised Dark Knight Rises for how it recreated that Nightfall storyline where Bane broke the bat. I thought that was done very well.
Yeah, I thought like once again you got to be faithful to the comic, and I don't think you could. I think a lot of people want to see the Nightfall storyline in that sense. Bane appears, he's going to break the Batman's back. How are you going to do it? Are you going to do it artistically? In the Nolan film, it's kind of artistic, and then the back break happens so fast. You're like, oh my God, what happened? Did he lose? Where if you look at the panel from the original Nightfall, it is like this most dramatic panel of Batman's back breaking upon the knee, the impact, the coloring in that scene. It's just all emphasized around the Batman. And you're like, oh my God, it's really intense. So I'm wondering if they keep adapting Batman, like, will somebody really truly be able to capture how crazy that scene actually is? Because Nolan's only done it, it's pretty well done, but I'm honestly looking to see if anybody else will try to do that in the future.
Hey, time will tell. But that actually brings me into my next question that I wanted to talk with you about. So, for you, just as an audience member and as a viewer, when it comes to adaptations of source material, how important is faithfulness to the source material?
I would say you can't adapt everything, but you should at least respect the vision of the character. So if you look at the way like Sony approaches some of their Marvel films, it's just like sometimes you're just like, what is going on here? Like I haven't seen Web, but some of the biggest criticisms is that they changed so much of the Spider-Man lore in it. It doesn't even make sense. And that's the big thing is messing with like critical story elements like in a superhero that's so beloved, you really have to be careful. Like you wouldn't Batman would not be Batman without the tragedy at the movie theater, and Spider-Man would not be the Spider-Man he is if Uncle Ben died. But then again, you could be kind of loose with how you do that. Like the MCU Spider-Man doesn't really mention Uncle Ben. It's implied that he's already gone, or maybe he never had an Uncle Ben, but they have their own tragedies. And I think the biggest thing is you just have to not make a superhero movie or take a piece of literature and adapting the movie just for the sake of adapting it. You need to do your research. You have to do your homework. Like it's almost impossible to make a faithfully adapted screenplay if you're just like, I'm gonna make a Superman movie, but I don't know who. I've never read a page of Superman. Like I wouldn't do that in my right mind. But some studios just want to renew a license or a title, and you get a really bad movie that's not really well made.
Well, actually, in regarding faithfulness to the source material, since you were just talking about Superman, apparently before we got Superman Returns back in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, I think it was, there was actually a Superman feature in development before Superman Returns. It was going to be directed by Mick G. and J.J. Abrams, I think, was writing it. But one big change that they made was in the script, they changed up Superman's origin story where he was sent to Earth and he crash landed in Kansas. But the change that it made was that Krypton was not destroyed. It didn't blow up. It was just in the middle of this big war. So Krypton still existed while he was down on Earth. And do you think that that would have translated well to the screen or no?
I think that would have been very controversial, even for that choice, because the sense that Superman is special and that Zod comes to Earth and it's like, oh, Superman's not like the last Kryptonian, but he's one of the few remaining. That's the thing that makes Superman like there's a lot of things that make Superman special, but for his story, a big part of that is he's one of the last Kryptonians, and the only other Kryptonian he meets for a while is a bad guy. The world when they first discover Superman aren't very trusting of him. So when Zod comes and starts messing everything up, it's not a good look for him. And that's like kind of the bigger plot point is Krypton kind of has to be the catalyst for Superman, which is like, yeah, if Krypton's destroyed by civil war, that could be different and you could go back to Krypton, but that doesn't really help drive the narrative as well as just losing Krypton, never being able to see your home planet, never being able to go back. I think that's a really good driving force behind Superman and what makes him kind of motivated to protect Earth. Because if Krypton's still around, why would he want to stay back Earth? He would just try to get home, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to how adaptations are handled and when they try to make their own version out of what the source material is, do you think that adaptations can still stay true to the source material even if they try to make their own version out of it?
Yeah, I mean, look at Harry Potter. They eventually start spinning a lot. They cut out a lot of stuff that people like from the books, which and sometimes it really works for its benefit. Like in the earlier movies, they stay true, but they have to cut some things out, and it's still a really good adaptation. And sometimes it doesn't work. If you look at Half Blood Prince, that's like the most confusing movie you'll ever watch. That isn't like that is a like an adaptation because in the Half Blood Prince, a lot of that story in that book is Harry's reading a book called The Half Blood Prince, and he's gaining information from that book, and he doesn't do that in the movie. So when he hits Malfoy with Sectum Sempra, and he gets all the cuts. You can rewind that movie as much as you want. There's actually no point in the movie where he learns that spell because in the book he reads about Sectum Sempra and teaches it to himself. They skip that part.
Yeah, I think the best thing that we got is there was that brief scene where he just looks in the book and he sees the spell Sectum Sempra and it just says four enemies. We don't really see him read too much about it after that.
Yeah, so it's a very confusing scene because usually up until then, a lot of Harry Potter movies are really well structured in the sense that they find this thing, it might be not relevant now, but it's relevant later. In the Philosopher's Stone, there's so many things that they find that become relevant later at the end of the film. And in Half-Blood Prince, they don't find anything that's super relevant. And it just other than the reveal that Snape's like, I'm the Half-Blood Prince. But like there's just so much that confuses you about that movie. You're like, what happened? What's happening?
Well, and actually, the next thing I wanted to bring up, because I know that it's your favorite movie of all time from our last discussion, was Jurassic Park. Because I know that you've also read the book, right?
Yes, so the Jurassic Park's really interesting in the sense that Michael Crichton wrote like prologues before the actual story started. So there's one scene that as far as my knowledge, hasn't been put into a Jurassic Park film yet, which is so essentially if you read the book, there's these like prologues of like incident reports. And there's an incident report where a baby got pulled through their window at home, and the local authorities wrote it off as a coyote attack, given to where the attack happened and what country it was in. But the thing about the things that leave the report of mystery is that the claw marks left in the person's house are like way thicker and way wider than a coyote's claws. The brutality of this of the murder scene is like way more gorier than any like coyote attack incident. So they write it off as maybe a pack of coyotes got into the house somehow, but it's a visceral scene that they describe, and only to be kind of hinted at that it was a velociraptor, you know. But that's kind of the first mystery of that. But the thing that's really interesting is that the opening scene of Jurassic Park Lost World, where the girl is ganged up on by the little small dinosaurs, that's prologue two in the original Michael Crichton book. That whole scene is like word for word done in Lost World. So even though Lost World isn't a great movie, that is actually a really well adapted scene from the original book. And then what's his name? The professor, the guy who heads Jurassic Park. I totally just spacing on his name. John Hammond dies in the book. He gets eaten by a T-Rex, or it's implied he's eaten by a T-Rex. He basically, the Gallimimus, they startle him while he's trying to leave the park. By the way, he's not a caring grandfather at all. Like the moment things go wrong, he's like every man for himself, and he tries to escape the park. And he's running up a hill. He hears a T-Rex roar, and he gets startled. And since he's an old man, he falls and he breaks like his hip. And then they don't really say what happens to him, but it's either implied that a T-Rex gets him or that the Gallimimus surround him and start nipping at him, and it's implied that he's eaten by both or one. Nedry's death's a bit more graphic in the book. Where in the movie they kind of cut away. They really kind of go into detail of how Nedry dies in the book. It's not good. Malcolm dies in an implied death scene where after his injury in the movie where he's like sitting by himself with that infamous scene where Jeff Goldblum's shirt's kind of like, you know, open and you see his bare chest. In that scene in the book, he's lying on a table, injured. I think he's got like an arm injury from what I remember, and a velociraptor tears through the roof of that, and it's implied that it gets Malcolm. You never hear from Malcolm again in the book. They never mention him again, so it's implied that he's eaten by a velociraptor. And then the woman character, she doesn't even exist in the book. I'm spacing on all their names right now.
Ellie?
Yeah, Laura Dern's character, she doesn't exist. It's just the only three people who make it out of Jurassic Park, Grant, and then the two kids only make it out.
Despite all the changes that the movie makes to the book, do you think that it's still a good adaptation?
I think it's the best version of adaptation because I think that changing the order of like in the fates of characters in a way that makes sense makes it so you aren't spoiled by the book. So I think that Jurassic Park does it in the best way because I think there's still characters in the book who die off because they're not that critical to the plot. And then there's characters who got killed off who didn't necessarily need to be killed off. The really only major change from the source material character wise is John Hammond's personality. They completely just change it, which I don't think is a bad thing. Where John Hammond kind of also was a message of like, oh, he's letting the wealth get to his head. Like that's where John Hammond in the book kind of was at too. But they wanted to obviously include a character who was more optimistic about the dinosaur thing. That's kind of where they changed it up. But I thought Jurassic Park, even then, I still think they do it in the best way they can.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed looking back at Jurassic Park, so this is a movie, this is an adaptation that was also written by the author of the book. And if you look at other movies like The Godfather or The Exorcist, along with Jurassic Park, those are all movies that were also written by the authors of the book as well. And do you think that maybe having the author also write the script for the movie is always a great way to guarantee that the adaptation could be successful? Or do you think it's not always a guarantee?
Um, it depends. I think it depends on like their how they visualize the film. I haven't read it or seen it yet, but I know it's pretty well rated. And I did buy the first book. But Neil Gaiman, he's a award-winning author, writer, and he wrote The Sandman. He wrote Sandman, like the original graphic novel, and then he wrote the Netflix TV show, which was really well adapted. And I think it just all relies on like what you can envision for a graphic novel or a book, and then how you can translate that into a film or a TV show. And I think, yeah, it helps to have the author around because they might have ideas on how to make this work in a movie than how to make it work from a book, but also you would have to see how much of the source material they're willing to kind of be flexible with, because there might be some people who are so dedicated to their story that they don't even want you touching it. Like there's no more, you can't do a Dr. Seuss movie anymore because the state won't straight up, they just won't let you. And I think like the Grinch movie that was adapted, the second Grinch movie that was done by Illumination, that was probably a miracle because after the Mike Myers Cat in the Hat movie, after it was rated so poorly, Dr. Seuss's wife was like, you guys aren't making any more of this. So it's just, it all has to kind of eventually boil down to the estate. Like look at the Tolkien estate. It is hard to do a Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, and Hobbit in one go. You don't get all three from that estate. So it's really hard to, even if you want to use the lore of the Silmarillion in your Lord of the Rings adaptation, you can't because you don't own the rights to the Silmarillion. You know, it's all about how stingy they're going to be with their licenses from whatever estate from the author you're getting it from.
Yeah, and speaking of famous authors, one author who's definitely had a lot of his work adapted is definitely Stephen King. A lot of his horror stories have been adapted. One of the most, I would say, popular ones is definitely The Shining from 1980. Yeah, this is often regarded as one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and this is also one of the I think few adaptations of his work that Stephen King is, famous for disliking. And I think his main complaints with the film come from the changes that it made from the book. And well, I can understand that. I can still appreciate the film for how good it was. And because, if you think back, it's another movie where, yeah, it might not have been very faithful to the source material, but it was still able to put its own spin on it and be an enjoyable film overall.
Yeah, I think I'm not super familiar with the Stephen. I haven't read much of Stephen King or any at all, and I haven't. I've seen The Shining like on TV back in the day, but I mean Stephen King releases so many books a year that it's gonna be hard for all of your books to get adapted. And I think Kubrick making a Stephen King movie, that's pretty. If I was Stephen King, I'd be honored. But obviously I'm not Stephen King, so I can't tell. I don't know how Stephen King feels. But yeah, I mean, as far as what I know, people really like The Shining. I mean, it's not the if Stephen King's worried about like how that was adapted. I mean, I think he might have learned his lesson with another movie, which was so bad, poorly adapted from his book, that he sued for his name to be taken off of the movie title. And he won. They took the movie title off, took his name off the title. I don't remember what movie it was, but I just know that happened. But, if you're protective about your own work being adapted, then you got to work something out with your agent and the rights to it. Like you got to put a clause in every contract being like you have to be there. It's you're if you're protective of your writing, as I was told once, that means your head's full of nuance. You're really protective of your stuff, so you just most movie sets would bring on the original person who wrote that script to at least see what's going on. And but script changes are bound to happen. Stephen authors write in so much detail, that which James Gunn once brought up. It's really like you write so much detail in a book that all of that cannot be translated into a 2-hour movie. So a bunch of stuff gets put on the cutting room floor, and it's really, you're looking at the key points of the story that matter. So whatever got cut out of The Shining or got changed, it clearly was adapted well enough to be a movie that everyone really, really liked, the majority of viewers.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to other Stephen King adaptations, there are others that have also been adapted more than once. There are some that have been adapted twice and we'll probably see adapted again in the future. Some of them are Carrie and It, but one other that comes to mind is Pet Cemetery. And I look at the Pet Cemetery remake from, I think that movie came out in 2019 during our sophomore year of college. And when that movie came out, a lot of people were upset because of the change that it made from the book, where instead of the son dying and coming back as an undead, it was the daughter who died. And I can understand why people would be frustrated with that change, but the reason that I think it worked is because it still maintained the same theme that the book was exploring, but it explored it in a different way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you got to also look at what people view as more dramatic on a movie screen. And I just think that a daughter dying is probably viewed as way more dramatic because just how Hollywood kind of treats women and girls in general, I think it's viewed as really dramatic when like a girl dies tragically than a son or a brother or a father. Not saying it's like the best thing, but I just think that like if you look at what is probably viewed as more dramatic, I could see why they went that route. They're probably trying to shock you more, and they think that's probably what's going to work better.
Possibly. And actually, one other adaptation I wanted to talk about, just because it's not necessarily based off a book or anything, is the Clue film from 1985, which is an adaptation of the board game. This movie is obviously, one of the reasons why I think it works as an adaptation is because I think the Clue board game definitely has its own narrative to it. It's a murder mystery where obviously get to play as the characters. But I think that the reason the movie works, I mean, it's not one of my favorite movies of all time, but the reason I think it works is because it essentially works as a classic murder mystery told in a old school whodunit style, and all the characters are very eccentric and distinctive, and they each have their own unique presence on the screen as well. So that's why I think it also worked as a movie too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be something maybe with the success of the Barbie movie that people are going to try to really do is adapt things that didn't start as a book or a graphic novel or a video game. They're going to go through, they're going to try to do toys, board games, things that like odds we see like maybe someone try to do a Monopoly movie. But it's just with like the success of like game like the Barbie movie kind of reignited something that kind of died out really suddenly because there was like a Lego movie like that was going for a little bit. They almost had a franchise going and then they canceled the Lego Batman 2 movie and then we just never saw another Lego movie. But like if you look at those movies, those are like they're adapting toys. They're playing with toys. I haven't seen Clue, but I know people love that movie. But yeah, it just like you can take almost anything and adapt it as long as the creative talent behind it is passionate enough about it. Because like someone who's passionate enough about playing Clue the board game that they're like, I can make a movie out of this.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But next up, and I've been looking forward to talking with you about this one, and this is Batman the Animated Series from the 90s. So I'm not gonna lie, I think that this might be my favorite adaptation of the character and the mythology that's built around him. I grew up on Batman the Animated Series. I grew up on this and Batman Mask of the Phantasm. They both made me the massive Batman fan that I am today. And yeah, they're just really, it's something that's really close to my heart?
I think that is the Kevin Conroy's Batman. You were definitely right. Is the best version. That team. I mean, I think like you have Bruce Timm working on that show, who is just amazing.
And Paul Dini and Eric Radomski.
Paul Dini, yeah. Yeah, it just you have some of the best creative talents on DC working on that show. And I mean, that show spawned Harley Quinn. Like she didn't exist until that show. As we were saying earlier, it gave a lot of characters who didn't really have much of a background a reason to care about them. You get introduced to all these characters really early on in season one, like the Clayface episode where you see that he has this addiction to this pill that like will keep his disfiguration and he becomes Clayface and he's a really successful actor and he wants to just stay who he is, but this disease that he has is turning him into this clay monster. It's like in the comic it's still very comic booky, like who's turning into a clay monster? No one, but you can understand like his gripe, his grievances with this unfair affliction and I think one of the best parts about Batman the Animated Series that people forget is that Batman doesn't beat up the mentally ill. He wants to rehabilitate all these people. He's trying to save them. He doesn't let them escape Arkham. They get out of Arkham because of Gotham's poor infrastructure. But Batman he just wants these criminals these supervillains, these people who get locked up in Arkham. He wants to save them. That has always been what Batman is. He's a symbol for these organized crime bosses to be afraid of, but for those villains that he fights, like Mr. Freeze, the Joker, those people he wants to save from that life because those people may have not have had a choice, or maybe like Mr. Freeze very clearly just wants to save his wife. And Gotham has not left him with a whole lot of options. So he's taken matters into his own hands. He's going to terrorize Gotham's upper class. He's going to rob banks. He's going to do everything in his power to save his wife because it's Gotham's fault. And, because he loses all his funding to his project, everything the rug gets pulled out from under him. It's some of the best scenes in Batman is him having those personal moments with his villains, or, you seeing why they would be a villain and you can sympathize with why they would want to take that route. Or some of the best scenes early on in Batman, the animated series in season 1, is there's a scene where Batman kind of redirects this upper class citizen of Gotham to a drug recovery rehabilitation center, and the guy finds his son in there. It's one of the best moments in the show.
Yeah, I remember that episode. That's a great one. Yeah, the animated series had so many great episodes. They'd had so many great episodes that really showed Batman shine. They also had great episodes that really, what's nice is the villains in the show, they weren't just villains, they were also characters. And what I mean by that is
Yeah,
the show fleshed out each of these villains and made them more than just antagonists, which was nice. And like you said, you can really sympathize with them and you can also get attached to them as characters as well.
which I think that's what people are so dedicated to the Batman mythos. Like, you see other adaptations, like we could go and look at the most recent Suicide Squad game that stirred up a lot of controversy with how they treated some characters. Like, people are really attached to that mythos, and I think that show is one of those reasons, because like they spent a lot of time fleshing out these characters, so people just don't like to see bad things happen to them. Which I think in another way is a sense of like, wow, you guys really made a really impressive adaptation. Like, people almost treat these characters like they're real people, and I think that's probably some of the highest compliments you can get from your adaptation of a character. Like Master of the Phantasm, I think personally it's the best Batman movie ever made. I think it's well written. I think the twist is really good. I think it gives you it not only is it an origin story to the Batman during a film where he's been Batman for a while, it's an origin story for the Joker, which is just something you don't realize until like the movie ends. You're like, what?
Yeah, and I think that what's great about Mask of the Phantasm as an adaptation, of the character at least, is that it gives both Batman and Bruce Wayne an arc in the movie. Because in the present time where you have Batman going after the Phantasm, that's sort of Batman's arc. But then when you have all the flashbacks, it's really Bruce's arc, because that's his side of the story, whereas the present is Batman's side. And it does such a great job, not just the movie, but the show as well. It does such a great job adapting the duality of Batman and Bruce Wayne as well.
Exactly. And I think that like again, duality of Bruce Wayne, what he's meant by the Phantasm, it's like he is coming face to face with the duality of being the billionaire Bruce Wayne and being the symbol of Gotham's protector, Batman. That's what the Phantasm kind of represents, in the sense that like this is like the culmination of what it means to be Batman and Bruce Wayne. And like the Phantasm, it's like you don't see the Phantasm in much of other DC comics, because the way the Phantasm is written into this movie, it's like you can't do that story more than a few times before everyone catches on to what the Phantasm storyline's about. So that's why there's like one adaptation of the Phantasm, but it's so good. And if you haven't seen it and you're a Batman fan, like, you gotta watch it. It's it's part of like every Batman collection you can find. I'm sure a lot of streaming service. I know Max has it, HBO Max has it. But yeah, I when Kevin Conroy passed away, who played Batman in that show, I the first thing I did that weekend he had passed, I watched Batman: The Mask of the Phantasm again, and you're just kind of reminded of just like how expertly done the cast, the writers, the directors, how much effort was poured in that series, that it's timeless. You could watch that show forever.
Yeah, I did the same thing after he passed. I went back and I rewatched Mask of the Phantasm, and I also rewatched the animated series because I just felt like I kind of needed to. And I think I guess what made it kind of sad was that I also got to that episode, The Gray Ghost, where we also heard Adam West's voice, when he was voicing the Gray Ghost. And At that moment, what kind of made me upset is we have both these classic Batman actors, Adam West and Kevin Conroy, who are both gone now, and seeing them interact in the show kind of was sad, but it was also kind of just really nice to see as well.
Yeah, I think like once again, there's a Batman for every generation. Kevin Conroy is playing Batman for so long. He's Batman for a lot of people, like hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of people. You could go even higher in those numbers. Everyone has heard Kevin Conroy as Batman at least once, whether you knew it or not, because he's in so many video games, so many TV shows, so many movies.
Yeah, but aside from everything that the show and the Mask of the Phantasm accomplished, one thing that I give the show credit for is that it doesn't just work as a superhero show. I think that aside from like I said, it works as a Batman show and a superhero story, but what's also great about it is that it works really well as, I think, a noir detective show as well. It has that sort of feel to it, and it also works as a crime saga show as well, which I think is unique because they all blend together with Batman and the mythology.
Yeah, I definitely think that on my rewatch, I'm currently watching I was just on the episode where I'm still in early seasons. I think it's season one. There's a guy running, I don't know if it's the mayor or he's running for Gotham City Council, I forget, but he's paying a demolitionist to blow up old homes in Gotham.
That's Appointment in Crime Alley, I think it is. That's with Roland Daggett.
Yeah, and it's a really just like that's another thing about animated series is it's not a villain of the week show. It's like not only is he fighting his villains, he's dealing with Gotham's underground crime syndicates. These people who aren't really villains, but they are still the people who kind of controlled Gotham City from the shadows, which eventually turns into most comic books that turns out to be the Court of Owls, which we haven't had an adaptation of other than one video game where Gotham Knights adapted some of that story. But the Court of Owls could be something if we're talking about adaptations that if I want to see an adaptation of, I think the Court of Owls is sitting right there to be adapted. I think maybe it's just a bolder storyline, and I think you have to be really careful with the approach of Court of Owls just because people are going to be there's going to be pressure there.
Yeah, but aside from the animated series, another show that I did want to bring up actually was the Last of Us show from early 2023, which had its first 9 episode season, which I really, really liked. Have you played the Last of Us game?
I have not watched the show. I have played part 1 and 2. From what I'm hearing and what I've seen, I think the Last of Us adaptation does a lot of stuff that you couldn't do in the game because what's the episode where in The Last of Us you find the character Ron Swanson plays and he does not like you. He doesn't. I think you're playing as you're rotating between Ellie and Joel at this point, and he doesn't like Ellie. He doesn't really like Joel, but they have a history. But the show takes liberties to go into the background of that character, and otherwise, kind of written off as an asshole in the game. He is a lot deeper and more complex than that in the show, as they showed. I've seen parts of that episode for discussions online, and I think that's what's like that's what you can do. And a lot of people think because they do kind of offhandedly mention that this character is gay in the game. But you have to do that by exploring the level. You have to find notes that he's left behind, journals. They're only mentioned in stuff that the player would not get that information directly. So in the show, they adapt that into a more direct way and they give him a background and origin. And it probably some people really, and a lot of people say that was one of the best episodes of TV that came out last year. So yeah, I think that like the stuff that you would miss in The Last of Us, and they adapt that into the TV show in a way that really works.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the reasons why the show worked out so well because the thing about it, yeah, it does make its own version out of the story that the game told, but it really stays true to the themes that the game was exploring, and it also stays true to the heart of the game as well. Like when it comes to the relationship of Joel and Ellie, which I would say is definitely the heart of the story when it comes to The Last of Us. This show did such a great job adapting that. Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey did such a great job perfectly capturing the essence of both characters that were previously played by Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker, so that was definitely well done. And yeah, like you were talking about, when it came to the character of Bill, his story was definitely expanded in this show in episode 3 with the character of Frank, who he was in a relationship with. But what's also great is they introduced a couple of new characters, specifically the character of Kathleen, who was the leader of the bandits. They also kind of changed up how the pandemic started and everything. And what I like about it is it's important for adaptations to stay faithful, but again, like we were talking about, you can still make your own version out of it. And why I think those changes or expansions worked is because they showed us what we might have been missing out on from the game.
Yeah, exactly. Then again, it's like there's also changes that have to happen visually. Like I know that they don't do spores in the show; they do something else, and it works in the game because the camera is tied to the back of whatever character you're playing. You can see the spores. You have the gas mask mechanic that is a part of the game. You have to use the gas mask. Where in the show, how do you show the spores from all angles? Like they're spores; they're in the air, so it's not as impressive visually on a movie where it would work in a game where you have you're generating effects and things that the player would be moving through, where in a TV show you're not the player, you're the spectator, so they have to change it. So there's things like that you have to sometimes change the visual aspects of whatever you're adapting, especially for a video game.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, last thing I wanted to talk about before we wrap is, so when it comes to adaptations, is there anything that hasn't been adapted yet that you'd really like to see adapted in the future?
I think the Focus Home, I think that yeah, it's Focus Entertainment has a game, it has two games right now called Plague Tale Innocence and Plague Tale Requiem, which is about a rat apocalypse that I when playing I was like this could work as like I could see this being a TV show because it's mainly a puzzle game. It's a puzzle adventure game essentially where you're mainly trying to avoid this rat plague, but also there's like the Inquisition that's chasing out this like Inquisition of knights chasing after you. But I think that would work. I also think that I would like to see Mr. Miracle adapted for superheroes, and then there's a game called the Banner Saga that I think if you're hungry for fantasy, Banner Saga could be adapted into like a TV series. But mainly, I would like to see games. I think there's a lot of good games. I'm still rooting that we get a good Resident Evil adaptation one day.
Yeah. All right, but anything else you wanted to bring up before we wrap, Max?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about adaptations, if you don't mind, I did do a review on the Suicide Squad game. So if you want to see more Suicide Squad content, I do have a video done on that. But other than that, I'm very grateful for being here.
It's good to have you back, Max. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks. I love talking about stuff like this. I could talk for hours, as you can see.
All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you later.